A conversation with retired philosophy professor Thomas Metzinger, whose entire career and life really has been focused on the analytical philosophy of mind and the study of consciousness, was bound to be fascinating and enriching. And it really was. Now, I wanted to find out from Thomas what he had learned about consciousness through his research and his practice, and he has written 7 books on the subject. And he wanted to learn about my journey into Tibetan Buddhism and the 3 years that I spent living and studying in India. Together, our conversation really brought me back to the roots of Buddhism, to the study of consciousness, to the practice of meditation, and so much more. And we, of course, got into the connection between his work and the work of Professor Karl Friston, who was the one who recommended that I speak with Thomas in the first place. And we also talked about some really pressing issues like the mental health crisis in young people and how to, as humans, better prepare ourselves for the world that we live in, which commoditizes attention. And we also talked about how Thomas spearheaded a letter requesting a moratorium until 2050 on AI research that aims at or risks the emergence of AI consciousness. Re listening to my conversation with Thomas in preparation to release this episode, I really wish that I had asked certain questions in the moment, which I didn't. And at the same time, I can imagine that spending an entire weekend talking with Thomas would lead to some of the most eye opening and thought provoking conversations of my life. Enjoy this episode of Think with my guest, Thomas Metzinger. Thomas Metzinger, welcome to Think.
Thanks for having me.
I'm super happy to have you here. Actually, you were born in Frankfurt, which is not far from where I immigrated to in Germany, in Dusseldorf. And you spent the better part of your life contemplating, researching, and writing about human consciousness. You've had a very meaningful career, various professorships as the founder and board member of different foundations, as a member of the European Commission's high level expert group on artificial intelligence, and as an author with, if I counted correctly, 7 books. If I counted correctly, your contributions have been rightfully recognized by many institutions, and you were elected to the German National Academy of Sciences Leopoldina in 2022. And it was Karl Friston who suggested that I should reach out to you to have a conversation after I tried my best to talk to him about consciousness. And he said he's not an expert, but he knows people who I should talk to. And he said I should talk to Thomas Metzinger. But before we get into what I believe is going to be a very nice conversation, what would you like my listeners and viewers to know about you?
Oh, well, I'm just a retired old man for 2 years now. I've been mainly working in an area that's called analytical philosophy of mind, but in a very interdisciplinary fashion. So I've always talked to neuroscientists and cognitive scientists a lot. I've done a lot of cognitive science myself, and I've tried to open the field of analytical philosophy of mind to interdisciplinary cooperation. And else there isn't so much to say, I think.
Well, I definitely want to hear more about the analytical science of mind, because looking at, I mean, if you look just Wikipedia, it says you're a philosopher, but then when you start looking into your writings and your research, it doesn't seem like the typical philosopher. You sent me one of your books with an just insane amount of research and analysis in it, which would not be typical what one thinks of when one thinks of a philosopher. So, can you tell us a little bit more about this interdisciplinary aspect of what you've done and how that has maybe brought us to, a different understanding or a different approach to looking at the human mind and consciousness?
Well, so I grew up in the Frankfurt philosophy department, did my MA there, also my PhD, which was, of course, Frankfurt School heavily politicized. We were all on demonstrations a lot as young people, squatted houses, the resistance against the expansion of the airport, and so. And there was one book which turned my life, turned around my intellectual life in 1981, Analytische Philosophie des Geistes. where a Swiss philosopher by the name of Peter Viry actually translated a number of essential papers from the Anglo-Saxon analytical tradition. And that's when it first dawned to me that Germany was in a very special situation half a century after World War II, that most of our intellectual traditions had been destroyed. Most of the elite, the Jewish intellectuals, had either been murdered or driven out of the country. And many tradition lines between teachers and disciples had also been cut. And what I was not so aware of is that in other areas of the planet, philosophy had still been going strong all the time. In Australia, suddenly philosophers like Alan Place or Jack Smart, Australian materialism became important, or Canadian philosophers like Paul Churchland. And then I saw that there was a much higher standard of conceptual clarity and unideological thinking in the Anglo-Saxon world, and that there had been real progress and decades of new developments, which most of my colleagues in Germany were completely unaware of. And I still knew when I was a little PhD student and I was allowed to be somehow like fly on the wall at the Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Bielefeld. And I met Dan Dennett in a swimming pool and talked to him. And I saw all these American philosophers where I saw they would do unbelievable things like come in sneakers and short pants to give a talk and be very substantial, intellectually very substantial, conceptually very clear, and not as pompous and ideological as I knew it from a lot of my intellectual environment in Germany. And that kind of convinced me. I was deeply impressed by all these people I saw for the first time: Jaegwon Kim, Ernie Lepore, Donald Davidson. I saw all these people live, the young Robert van Gulik, Dan Dennett, of course. And I instantly saw there's something going on there that is really substantial and clear and which has a different flavor. So I got hooked onto this Anglo-Saxon community. And then I saw that they much more naturally also mingle, say, with neuroscientists
Hmm.
or integrate empirical data into their philosophical work. And for a time, 2, 3 decades, I teamed up, for instance, with Wolf Singer's department in Frankfurt and did we did common seminars and workshops and stuff with neuroscientists. What should neuroscientists know about modern philosophy of mind? What should every philosopher know? And then I also formed a group of young people, the Mind Group. People can get an impression if they just go to open-mind.net. There's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of open access material there, where I find out if you put young people together, neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, computer scientists, good young philosophers, and leave them alone, they will cooperate perfectly well. If you have the old guys in the room where people have to start to show off or think, maybe this guy has a job for me later or so, everything's contaminated. But I found out if you have something like a buddy system, like
Mm-hmm.
every philosopher, like I had, for instance, the neuroscientist Andreas Engel or Vittorio Gallese should have one buddy in neuroscience where they can just go
Mm-hmm.
in an unprotected way and say, "Listen, I don't understand it. What is a cross correlogram? You've explained this to me twice. I always forget it. Are these colored blobs? Do they mean anything, or are you just doing this for? Be honest. Are you doing this for career purposes and fool journalists, or is this valid? What I see?" And every neuroscientist, for instance, or AI person needs a philosopher where they can go and say, this is just obtuse. It's just, I can't read this. Can you help me understand this step by step without being embarrassed and without being in the public? And if you form these interdisciplinary groups and friendships emerge, I think it can really generate fruitful research and real results. And I think in Germany that has happened. There are now maybe 5 locations where you can do philosophy in a strongly interdisciplinary way. And there are a lot of brilliant kids around. And for my generation, it only dawned on me the task was to reconnect Germany to the global intellectual discourse after this horrible catastrophe.
Hmm.
And of course, way into the 68 movement, most of us were busy, also intellectuals, philosophers, with understanding how could this happen? I mean, the 2 world wars and everything, and the Third Reich, how could this happen? What in our intellectual tradition made this possible? So people were still very, very busy digesting the horror that had just happened and trying to stabilize a democracy, but then suddenly discovering philosophy has not stopped in other parts of the world,
Hmm.
right? And then, I mean, you immigrated to Germany. I wanted to immigrate to Canada very early on. My first trip ever was
Where
Canada.
where did you go in Canada on your first trip?
Well, the very 1 year before high school ended, um, we had this deal. We helped in the harvest, in the hay harvest, and then we could have a cottage on Christian Island in Lake Huron for 3 weeks for free. So we did both of this, and after I really wanted to burn my passport and build a log cabin with some hippies in northern Ontario, and I was very disappointed with me that I actually went back to the last year of high school. But then I came back for a much longer trip,
Hmm.
still with the firm intention to find a place to go. So I landed in Montreal. We did some canoe hikes and stuff for 6 weeks in northern Ontario. Then I hitchhiked down to New York City, back up. Then I hitchhiked all the Trans Canada to Vancouver Island. A lot of little adventures. Hitchhiked down because I just had to get to Haight Ashbury. Although I knew everything was over, I hitchhiked down to San Francisco. Very soon realized the difference between friendly Canadian Mounties and American Highway Police. Very different. Um, then I hitchhiked up back to Kamloops, and I got stuck without money in the Kamloops Christian Man's Hostel, flat broke. And the thing was, I still had to hitchhike back to Montreal to catch my plane. So end of November, early December, but had no money, and I needed warm clothes and underwear. So I had, to put it mildly, a lot of interesting experiences painting houses, picking grapes, picking apples for $8 a bin in and around Kamloops in the Okanagan Valley. And when I hitchhiked back, uh, I first the one and only time in my life I experienced minus 42. And as you see, I did not emigrate. So I don't know where that was somewhere Saskatoon or so,
Yeah, in the prairies.
in the middle. And I still know I had 3 pairs of socks and I was crying with pain, not because cold was long gone, but with the pain. And every ambulance and every police car gave me a lift. And they were all very unfriendly. They didn't like to give me a lift. They were very angry. Said, "You have no idea what you know, what you're doing. We've got hitchhikers dying every year, and we hate people like you." and But eventually, I made it to Montreal, and it was very memorable. I was looking. The plan actually was to look at communes. I was searching for a spiritual land commune
Hmm.
there, and visited a number of them along of the way, but I didn't really find a place where I thought I could be part of that project. And then I made a big mistake, a really big mistake. I got I descended into an academic career. And here you have me, 40, 45 years later.
Well, maybe a mistake that benefits the rest of us in terms of then all the research that you did, all the exploration that you did. So sometimes, yeah, going down one path, at least for the rest of us, we're very grateful that you did decide to go down that path and maybe not immigrate to a log cabin in Canada. And which actually makes me wonder, if I think of myself and what brought me to Buddhism, I can trace certain events. Of course, we trace red lines, but there's way more that happens for those things to materialize. For you to end up studying the mind, consciousness, I heard in an interview or a discussion that you had, I believe that you do meditate, yeah, regularly, so you
Yeah, yeah.
practice as well. Can you trace how that interest develop for you? Are there specific events, or was it just, yeah, a sequence of things that happened and slowly you ended up
No, I mean, I've thought about this a lot too. There are, of course, maybe more subtle things in my childhood, um, but there are two things um, that were probably very important. I was always often very sick as a child, and one time I had to stay in bed when I was 16 for about 3 weeks. And I was terribly bored, and on my father's bedside table, I found this book, which is still behind me in this thing, Georg Grimm, Die Lehre des Buddha, an exposition of the teaching of the Buddha.
hmm,
I did not understand a word of it. I thought it was all weird. But then I said this multiple times, but then I read this First Noble Truth, all life is suffering.
hmm,
And that was like somebody struck a bell. Um, because in philosophers' terms, this was something that had been inconceivable to me before. I would had not thought about this logical possibility,
hmm,
um, that there might be a perspective from which all of conscious experience is suffering. And I thought I learned this has something to do with meditation, and I don't understand all of this, but that's something I want to do when I'm a grown up, which I did 2 years later when I was 18.
hmm,
And another turning point was another serious pedagogical mistake of my father was to have a copy of The Doors of Perception lying around on his bedside table. He should have never done that. So that led to a second track of very serious exploration deeper, but much later, I mean. And then I picked up in 1976, I picked up a regular practice and have never stopped since then.
hmm.
So that's 47 years or 48 years soon. Uh, and as you know, it doesn't help.
And I mean, I have to say, yeah, we have twins that are going to be 5 in September.
Aha.
And definitely since the twins were born, regular sitting meditation practice. It's been hard to fit in a schedule amongst everything else. But in the last 3 weeks, so my wife went to the Dr. Joe Dispenza seminar in Switzerland, where they do different meditations, and we're always open to try new things, even though we have the traditional Buddhist meditations that we know. But hey,
Hmm.
why not try new things at different times if it fits with where you are? Um, then you can get some momentum. And for the last 3 weeks, I managed to meditate daily for 45 minutes. It's been quite a long time since I managed 3 consecutive weeks. And I hope it changes just a little bit, is my hope that there are these moments where I can have just that fraction of a second of distance between what I'm feeling and thinking and my reaction. But the consistency is needed. Yeah, in any
Yeah, well, there
case.
are very different opinions about this, as you know. Technically speaking,
Hmm.
over the centuries, there have always been the gradualists who say goes step by step,
Hmm.
and there have been this what philosophers call the subitists, the people who teach sudden enlightenment, who say basically say there's nothing you can do. Um, I think it's both completely true
Hmm.
in its own way, but I have found that the general torrent of life, the onslaught of everything is so strong
Hmm.
that a minimal regular practice of two sitting periods a day is in no way, how to say, getting too engaged about it or getting too technical about this thing. It just to touch the ground again
Hmm. Hmm.
regularly twice a day. Um, uh, is very important in the kind of life we live because it's very easy to completely get drawn away from life's events, which can be very nice events like children,
Hmm.
but which can also be tragic events like people dying or political upheaval. It's good to have that anchor, uh, even if it doesn't do you any good. Maybe I should say that as a young man, um, of course, just like you, I've tried different techniques, traveled a lot in Southeast Asia, been in India and Nepal multiple times, and all that. Um, but as a young man, I've been strongly influenced by J. Krishnamurti after a certain time. So I attended his talks in Switzerland and in India.
Hmm.
And he was, of course, the extreme case of somebody who denied all teacher disciple relationships and anything that could be taught, and the very extreme case of somebody who said the first step is the last step, and there is nothing you can do, and nothing anybody can really teach you. And I think both things are right in a certain sense. There are aspects of this which cannot be approached by any form of technical approach or
Hmm.
psychological technique, however advanced, however serious. It's not something you will ever achieve. Uh, but on the other hand, I think in English one says boundary conditions, or the,
Yep.
right? You can create conditions or not. You can open the window and clean up your room. If anything, if the bird ever flies in or not, you will not know.
Hmm.
Um, but there are some things you can do, to just create conditions. And I've always found this very helpful. Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, I take it, even though I have my Buddhist education, I take my meditation practice at the moment in a very mundane way, just in the sense of, yeah, just reconnecting, just, trying to tune out everything that's not, I mean, not to have no thoughts, but to let those thoughts flow and to try and be focused on whatever it may be, breathing or something else, in a very mundane way, just to take some distance from the let's say, onslaught of sensory experiences that we have and demands around us. And I find that in those conditions, it allows me to be more open, to appreciate the beauty of things more, to let go a little bit of what's going on in my own emotions. So I take it at this point, I mean, just it may create conditions by sitting down for more, but to be very realistic as a father, work, normal life, right? I take it very, very mundanely. It's beneficial for my well being, for my ability to be more connected to others. And for the rest, well, as you say, let's see. You cannot. No one can teach you enlightenment. It cannot be taught. It can only be
Although
experienced.
there are a lot of people out there who have given themselves names and wear funny clothes, and YouTube is full of them who claim otherwise and do this. I mean, the historical phase in which we live also has something absolutely bizarre to it,
Hmm.
whereas even 5 decades ago, people would go for long and difficult travels in Asia when
Hmm.
they had this illusory feeling they need a teacher or something. And when they went into this trap, which many people go into, um, I cannot develop if I do not find the right kind of teacher. It's in my view, it's the same kind of thing many of us have had when they were very young and longed to fall in love, and thought, I don't want a relationship, and I don't want this, nonsense having a partner, what these adults talk about. I want to really fall in love.
Hmm.
Um, Many young people spend many years of their life trying to find the real thing in terms of another human being where they can fall in love. And I found that many of the so called spiritual seekers sometimes entertain themselves, for all of their life by this search. Always a new little technique, always a new little book,
Hmm.
always an exciting new teacher, and go ashram hopping and this and that. And it's like drug abuse,
Hmm.
there's a new stimulus, and it's very intense for a certain time, and it will keep the whole self model, the ego machinery afloat and well entertained for 4 weeks or 3 years.
Hmm.
And then there will be some cracks or something ugly you discover in the cult, or it doesn't work anymore, and then the search continues. And I think when one very important thing is to very deeply understand the searching mechanisms. The searching mechanism. What part of you is it that thinks it needs a teacher?
Hmm.
Not that traditions, lineages, and ancient wisdom, and also properly taught techniques have no value. Some people have to do this. It
Hmm.
has to be done, else it would disappear, right? But this mechanism of, if only I could flourish, I could this, I could that, if only, but I need to.
Hmm.
It's a very nice defense mechanism. And maybe we stop talking about me. Let's start talking about you. So I have seen that you took this BA, which very few people took. Why did you do that, and how was it?
Yeah, very few people. We ended up only being, I think, two or three groups that did it and graduated, partially because 2 years, no, 3 years into the program in India, there was a scandal of a minister who had a degree from an associated university, which this person had never actually attended.
Hmm.
So India decided, if you're a school that's affiliated to the same university, you need to be in the same state. And in our case, Kibi, the Karmapa International Buddhist Institute, was associated with Mewar University, which is in Rajasthan, so Delhi, Rajasthan. They could not continue their partnership. They were allowed to finish the students who had not yet completed their BA. But afterwards, it dissolved. And It wasn't easy. I think they tried to find another partner, another university, and they didn't succeed. So I think, I mean, we were six that graduated, if I remember correctly, the first year, and maybe six the second year, and three or four in the third group.
Yeah, but you must tell your listeners what that degree was.
Yes. Well, it was a bachelor's of arts in Buddhist studies,
Oh.
obviously focused on Tibetan Buddhism. It was at the seat of the Karmakaju lineage in Delhi. So it's the Karmapa International Buddhist Institute, which is partly a monastery in the sense there are about 45 monks that live there, Bhutanese, Nepalese, Indian. They all identify as Himalayan in culture, or as Tibetan in culture. And we were about 25 foreigners that lived
Mhm.
there. It was a really, really interesting program because it was a mix between traditional monastic teachings and Western academic teachings. So there are some books, you may know the Jewel Ornament of Liberation from Gampopa, which is a seminal work in the Karmakaju lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. We studied it over 2 years, page by page, sentence by sentence, taught by a Kempo, so by a Buddhist teacher,
Mhm.
translated from Tibetan to English with an interpreter,
Mhm.
and in true, let's say, monastic Tibetan monastic style. So read a paragraph, comment, explain it, move on to the next, engage with the students. Except for our philosophy teacher, Professor Sempadorje, who tried his best to impart on us the four philosophical schools. I had to rewrite them down: the Vaibhashika, Sautantrika, Chittamatra, and Madhyamaka, which I'm sure you know. And after his first lecture, he said, "Are there any questions?" And no one raised a hand. And he's like, "Okay, there's either one of two things happening here. Either you've all understood everything and you have no questions, or you've understood absolutely nothing and therefore you have no questions." But he was one of the most patient teachers and men that we've ever met in that context. And so it was very, very fascinating, to have both the emic and the ethics, so the internal and the external perspective on Tibetan Buddhism. And it was challenging, especially we had some monks that went through the program with us and who graduated with a bachelor's, and some went on to do master's degrees afterwards. And sometimes the Western interpretation of the history and the events is completely different than the internal Tibetan perspective
Oh,
on
sure.
those same events. And they were confronted with another view on narratives and stories that they had heard throughout their entire lives. And I have to really give them credit for navigating that, and trying to find where they then fit within these multiple interpretations of similar events and similar historic, let's say, narratives. So it was, yeah, quite the experience living for three
But
years.
it brings up a number of other. Would you call yourself a Buddhist right now, as we
Yes,
speak?
yes.
Uh, what was the first time in your life where you would have said, "I call myself a Buddhist"? How old were you when you said that?
Uh, so I was probably 26 or 20, no, wait, 28, 29, around there. My first exposure to Buddhism was when I was about 16 or 17 years old. A close friend of mine died. She was unfortunately hit by a car. She was leaving work on rollerblades. We were teenagers. Um, and she crossed the street, but not at the crosswalk. She crossed behind, and she was behind a lamppost. And she couldn't see that there was a car coming who was going on the yellow red. She was just looking at her light. And so when the light turned green, she stepped forward, and the driver never saw her because she was behind the lamppost. So it was an accident. It just so happens that the driver of that car knew her. We all went to the same high school.
Mhm.
So just a terrible set of circumstances. And in my grief, I forget if it was my parents, but someone gave me a book on meditation and Buddhism. And I read it, and similar to you, I understood nothing,
Mhm.
literally. And I tried to meditate based on the meditation that was in this book. And after 2 weeks, I'm like, what's supposed to happen? Am I doing this right?
Mhm.
I don't understand this. And I stopped. But that was my first introduction to Buddhism and to meditation. In university later on, I took an elective, which was about Buddhism, so an introductory course to Buddhism, but that was very academical, the different schools, the history. We did go to a Zen Buddhist, let's say, center in Montreal.
Where in Canada are you from? Where was
I'm
it?
I'm from Montreal,
All
so
right.
yes, I was born on the North Shore of Montreal, and I grew up on the South Shore.
Okay.
And we went to a Zen Buddhist center, and we meditated, and that's where it seems like some Zen Buddhist centers have the stick of compassion, it's called, to help meditators to keep the proper posture. But
Mhm.
still, it didn't click. It was a great experience, but I didn't start practicing or continue reading about it. Fast forward to living in Germany. In 2009, I went to spend Christmas and New Year's with my brother who lived in Senegal at the time.
Mhm.
And January 1st, 2010, writing down my New Year's resolutions. Instead of writing, I stop smoking or go to the gym, I said, let me find something different. And I wrote down, find a place to meditate once a week. Came back to Dusseldorf, Googled, Buddhism Dusseldorf Center, and I landed on the Diamond Way Center of Buddhism. Started going there and started going weekly. And I would say it's within that process at some point that I really started reading, learning, and then I went to India the first time in 2011 for a
Yeah, that
course.
was the second question I was interested in. It's one thing to do that, but what was actually what prompted you to really enter a 3-year education program in another country?
Well, that's I connect to a question that my brother asked me. After a few years of practicing and going once to India, my brother and I were having. He lived, I think he'd lived in UK. Then he had moved to the UK, and we were having a conversation one evening. Had a few glasses of wine, and he said to me, Eric, are you going to do that thing that you always do? I'm like, what's that, Dave? He says, well, you get interested in something and you just go 100% and you have to, understand it as much as you can and you just fully focus on it. Are you going to do that same thing with Buddhism? That's a good question. I never thought about that. A few weeks later, I was in the Netherlands on a weekend course, and the German Austrian guy who was doing the interpretation was like, hey, Eric, did you know that we're actually launching a bachelor's course in Kibi? I'm like, isn't that interesting? And so I decided, after getting to know about the course and that it was a formal education and everything, to leave everything behind in Germany and go ahead and
And so,
move.
why didn't you go 100%? Where's your master's degree?
Well,
What's the next step?
okay. I'll answer this question, and then I want to ask you some more questions.
No, I want to know more about this.
So we finished the bachelor's degree, and we actually went to Montreal, and we started a master's degree in religious studies at McGill University. And while we were there, my father passed away. My father was 86 years old, and he had been quite frail for a number of years. Somehow, I think that it feels fitting in a way because my brother lives in UK, so my mother would have been alone if my father had passed away and we all lived abroad. It sort of seemed fitting that after my wife and I arrived and we were there to live, that was the time where his body and his spirit said, okay, sort of I can go, because now his wife, my mom, was not going to be alone. So we were there. And after 1 year of studying, we got tired of studying. And when we looked at, I was 34 at the time, I'm like, okay, if I want to work in academia in Buddhism, I need to finish my master's, do my PhD, then look for a job. I'm the new kid on the block. I'll be like 37, 38 years old. I'll be the new kid on the block. Um, our experience was that there's not that much investment in Buddhism in academia at the moment. It's difficult to get money. I think they even closed the Buddhist department in, is it Copenhagen or in Denmark, which had been open for like 120 years or something. Um, and so we thought, okay, is this the path? Do we want to go down this path to do research and to look for jobs in universities? And at the time, we felt that what we wanted as a married couple was to start a family.
Mhm.
Yeah, and for that to have work and to settle and to find a place where we could do that. And since I could get good work in Germany, and my wife is Russian. We would be closer to her family. We decided, okay, let's go to Dusseldorf. So I came in May 2017 and started looking for work. And after I found work, then in July, August, then Maria came and we settled here. Um, so, I mean, yeah, circumstances and also just not seeing the academic career.
No, that was probably right. I mean, I have, how to say, trained a number of generations of young people,
Mhm.
and I've had a very difficult and strenuous academic career myself. 38 is too late, because you compete against people who have done nothing else for all those years
Yeah.
and have published a lot, and then it's a very small community, uh, scarce resources. And this would probably really not have been a good idea. But what I still want to know is, did you, I don't know how to put this, but
Yeah.
when you took this BA, did you
Mhm.
ever have the feeling, um, well, this is of course fancy and nice and exotic, but it could just be Catholics just teaching their tradition to Indians or Nepalese who come to America? Did you have the feeling there was anything beyond, say, the philological or just teaching the historical facts or the classical scriptures uh, that was alive there? For instance, did you have an intensified practice while you were there? How many sitting periods did you have during that BA?
We did not, like, not formally.
Uh huh.
So then it was really up to the individuals.
Yeah.
I would say the first year and a half, we were lucky. Circumstances allowed His Holiness the 17th Karmapa to regularly come teach us, and then have sittings with practice, but also with questions and answers, and really exchanges on, let's say, how do we live this? How do we practice? And if anyone who's been to sort of lectures or exchanges with Buddhist teachers will know that then there's the possibility, we're a small group as well, so there's really
Hmm.
the possibility to connect to what you're going through. We had, for example, a time where um, we were contemplating impermanence and death a lot as part of the text that we were reading, and to the point where at least myself, I almost started to become anxious about the fact that I can die at any moment. Like, it was counterproductive almost to have it so much in the forefront of my
Hmm.
thoughts and my consciousness. And at that time, His Holiness was able to come regularly, so we could ask him about that. And his answer was like, well, these teachings are meant to make sure that we don't ascribe too much importance to the material world, but it's not meant to debilitate you and scare you from leaving your room in the monastery.
Hmm.
So you can pull back a little bit and have somewhat a bit of certainty that tomorrow's going to happen and the next day. But if you realize that or if you hopefully realize that you're back into the mundane and the consumption and all of that, then go back to the teachings and remind yourself that this is very impermanent, right? And come back to your practice. After a year and a half, for a number of circumstances, it was more difficult for him and other teachers to come on a regular basis. So then it was really up to us as students. In our case, my wife and I was, or I can speak for myself, being a bit of an overachiever. I was quite focused on the academics during the academic year. But then in the summer, we would go to Dharamsala or Kathmandu, and we would have our intense 2-3 months of practice and improving the Tibetan language.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, could it have been exactly the same with a different, let's say, spiritual or religious content that was taught? Somewhat. Yeah. I mean, in the sense that it was a formal education, and within that, they didn't um, formally ascribe in the curriculum the practice and, yeah, these kinds of things. But at the same time, being the seat of the Karmakaju lineage in Delhi, we got a lot of traveling or teachers that would come by, that would stay, and that would be kind enough to offer us lectures and the possibility to interact with them. So, yeah, A little bit to your point, absolutely. And some moments in some years where we had really the possibility to go a little bit deeper and to have more connections and more practices and more teachers come and help us in our journey.
Hmm.
Which so we did it right, or the Tibetan way is very teacher student and very practice oriented, obviously. And you have, I think, with the interdisciplinary aspect of it, um, you have sought to marry the two or to see where they intersect and what we can learn from it. When I spoke to Karl Friston, I think for him, and hopefully he will forgive me if what I'm saying is not entirely correct, but for him, consciousness lies simply in the brain. And we spoke about that in our conversation. Um, if I take it from a Tibetan Buddhist perspective, that wouldn't be the case. What do you think through your practice,
Well,
through your research, through your
that's of course a long
collaboration?
story. I think we should not get. I probably have a lot of things to say that you would find very off-putting
Okay.
about consciousness, but I think, as in that new book, The Elephant and the Blind,
Hmm.
which is also freely available to everybody, I've followed this to not get bogged down into the metaphysics of consciousness.
Okay.
Is it a physical process or is it not one? But to just stay with the phenomenology as fine grained and possible and not
Hmm.
run away into the metaphysics. So I
Okay.
think, so I've been in this consciousness community for 35 years. And of course, there's a large group of people who are interested in the more hardcore science of philosophy because they have basically they have two fundamental motives. They're not clear about it. One motive is mortality denial. That
Hmm.
is, there's a large crowd out there who is seeking for something, even if they don't understand the science or the academic philosophy, that has the right ring to it, that
Hmm.
sounds right, and that it's not reducible to physics. And there is a little clever backdoor for survival after death. There's an enormous market for this. And of course, also some academics play to this wider audience. So you have one English word I had to learn many years ago is the quantum wackos. I still don't really know what a wacko is, but you have
Hmm.
this large group for decades who try to conjure up physics mysteries, quantum phenomena, and consciousness, and emptiness and vacuum, which has been proven dozens of times is all nonsense and doesn't follow. Um, but you have this large crowd that is interested in near-death experience, out-of-body experiences. Like I've worked a lot of on this, and just searches proof for something that is not in the brain, whatever
Hmm.
that means.
Hmm.
And then there is something else which is conceptually even more unclear. In English, you often call it meaning making.
Okay.
So people in pursuing, say, academic philosophy of consciousness or neuroscience, trying to understand it, or in pursuing meditation, or in experimenting more systematically with psychedelics,
Hmm.
or so, they seek um, an experience of meaningfulness,
Hmm.
something that is deeply self validating in a certain sense, that creates a sense of certainty, um, gives a coherence to their whole life. And many of them never really understand the difference between, does existence have a meaning in any well defined sense? Or do I have experiences of meaningfulness? And of course, you can create experiences, the phenomenology of meaningfulness. There are many ways to create it. For instance, join a cult, be in a little in group, fellow believers or so, all agree on the same model of reality. And, organized religion has served this market for many centuries in an
Hmm.
industry style. So there's in consciousness research, there's a lot of noise on the signal from
Mhm.
those people who have this feeling it cannot be right if it doesn't tell me there's life after death, and it cannot be right if it doesn't give me a deep sense of felt meaning somehow.
Mhm.
And to take all this away and look at it in as unbiased as possible a way, that is of course difficult. It's
Mm.
also painful. It's not something everybody can do. So this is a problem in the consciousness community. Now, this whole search for metaphysics, is it in the brain? Is it not in the brain? Can it be reductively explained or not?
Mhm.
What most people don't see is that this has a direct parallel in meditation practice. Namely, there will there's a possibility of staying with what is, not labeling it, and
Mhm.
staying with it, but in a super precise way, with high precision and with
Mm.
gentleness, staying with what is.
Mhm.
And there's this other route of reification, of following thought, following judgments.
Mhm.
And I think in research in consciousness, there's exactly the same dynamics on a theoretical level. And that is also why I have, from very early on, I've always been very interested in altered states of consciousness and what can we learn from it.
Mhm.
So for many people in the West now, meditation practice is some dubious self-optimization, capitalist self-optimization stuff. They just want to get richer or more efficient, or it's something like a pacifier for adults,
Mhm.
something to calm you down. And although it is very positive that this has spread so far and wide in the West, there's also a danger to it. Meditation in the beginning, at least for me, is an epistemic practice, an
Mhm.
epistemic project.
Mhm.
So it is something that serves the old philosophical goal of self knowledge, of gaining
Mhm.
self knowledge, as also all the Western tradition has said, not only the Eastern tradition. And the number of people who genuinely do it for self knowledge is already much, much smaller.
Mhm.
And the people who would stay with it if it doesn't give you rewarding experiences, or health, mental health, or something like this is even, again, smaller. And then there is a difficulty in understanding that the sought after knowledge might not be something propositional or conceptual at all.
Mhm.
It is a kind of knowledge that probably has nothing to do with you. It is a kind of knowledge that you cannot have. Metaphorically speaking, it is some primordial but reflective state that knows itself.
Mhm.
And the problem is rather for you to step out of the picture, uh,
Mhm.
to let this, become more manifest on a phenomenal level. Um, so, of course, this constant interaction between, say, some Buddhist teaching and do I believe it or not? Are people's people some centuries about said this? Do I believe this or not? This, of course, also contaminates the whole process
Mm.
because it invites you to constantly judge and evaluate your meditation experience as it
Mhm.
happens. It creates ever more subtle goal representations also.
Mhm.
Is it? Is this really not it? Is this effortful or is it effortless? What? And this can get ever subtler, and then of course it ruins the whole thing all the
Mm.
time. So I think a bit of theory is very, very helpful to come back
Mhm.
to it, but it can also contaminate the practice. And then there's a mirror image. I always thought it is completely bizarre if people want to be professional academic consciousness researcher
Mhm.
and they have never set a silent retreat, or they don't have a practice in their own life,
Mhm.
or they have never ever taken any of the classical hallucinogens and also more than one time,
Mhm.
and get scared but be proud to be able to say you've done it.
Mhm.
you know uh, I think for me an important question was always if altered states of consciousness have an epistemic potential.
Mhm.
That is, if things can be known, say in meditation or under the influence of some of the classic hallucinogens or something
Mhm.
like that, that cannot be known in any other way.
Mm.
I'm still very skeptical, critical about this. I wouldn't say yes. But one thing that is certainly important is it creates theoretical intuitions. Somebody who says works academically on some problem of consciousness or so, it would give them ideas, completely new perspectives, also non-perspectives, maybe,
Mm.
or an aperspectival knowledge about what a first person perspective is and things like that. And I've always been very suspicious of all these people who make brilliant careers in academia but never do any of this, um, because the suspicion is they are just interested in getting ahead, getting tenure, and making this career.
Mm.
I have always thought, and this may be my personal bias, I may be wrong, that anybody who has a serious interest in the problem of consciousness will try as many routes as possible.
Mhm.
Will be open to many different kinds of exploration, also not only to one meditation technique, but maybe
Mhm.
um, try different ones, and so on and so on. And I think you can see this current academia in the West. It has become absolutely brilliant. It's stressful, it's effortful, but if you just see how the academic standard, given all the difficulties, have risen over the last 30 years. If I look at the PhD thesis young people submit now, I see, and compare them to my own PhD thesis,
Mhm.
which I would have never let pass with any of my own PhD students. This wouldn't, what I submitted in 1985 in Frankfurt, this wouldn't ever have passed with me. And there's ever new generations. They become better, they become more brilliant.
Mhm.
This aspect is lacking. There's a degree of high professionality. People are stressed out, they have no time. But I think there is a narrowed epistemic interest, because if anybody was really interested in that topic, they would not just approach it from an academic perspective. They would try everything that comes their way, and then the mirror images, of course. I know so many people who have tried so many different things to approach the problem that they got completely lost.
Mm.
Developed problems with drugs, disappeared into cults, ruined their 20s in a way that didn't allow them to enter academia. So there's all kinds of difficulties. But I've coined this project, this concept of Bewusstseinskultur, a culture of consciousness, and I think we really
Mhm.
should. We need a much richer. We need one of my um, American German research assistant gave me this translation in my book, The Ego Tunnel, which was very good, well traveled. We need academic researchers in the field of consciousness science, which are not only, you know, impeccable in their academic training and all that scholarly, but they should also be well traveled
Mm.
in phenomenal state space. They should know what is out there. And I think you can see in this aggressive careerism in academia, you can see the result if you have people who are just extremely ambitious, extremely attached to career goals,
Mm-hmm.
then very well trained, and have never seen anything else,
Mm.
whatever it is, a Tibetan monastery or something like that, have never seen anything else, have never had a deeper meditation experience. They come out at 35, they are brilliant, they have formal tools, but they don't have good ideas. You know, they they know a lot, but now what?
Mm.
And I've always thought one should find a new solution and a new mixed methods approach there.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that succeeded. I can only say I found it. Um, I'm now retired for 2 years. I look back at
Mm-hmm.
my academic career. I find it a super strenuous, humiliating, very disappointing in large aspects, and in particular, a lot of human disappointments.
Mm.
Um, Things, all the scheming, the politics, which you fortunately never got to know in departments in a discipline like philosophy. Um, that really speaks against any deeper wisdom there.
But I definitely heard about it, and that was part of what we were thinking. Do we really want to get into
Exactly.
that? Yeah, I
And
mean,
there are people who say, people like you who say, no, I'm not doing this.
yeah, like it's the stealing of or finding ways to steal other people's grants and so on and so forth. There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
Tenures, professors that don't want to retire, and ends right. And when we heard about that from some of our professors with whom we had like open connections and we spent time with, that was also an element for us, which is like, oof, you know, we were still a little bit wide-eyed in the sense of Buddhism and studying it, and seeing how far we could go, and contributing to whatever, translating text and interpretation. But then when you hear of the world of academia, yeah, we didn't know if we wanted to enter that really
Yeah.
at almost 40, and think like, why, like that's um,
It also interferes with your practice. Can I ask you a question as
absolutely.
an unexpected question?
Yes.
I promise. So, when I turned into a very serious meditator at 18, 19, 20, I also looked into Tibetan Buddhism,
Hmm.
and I immediately discarded it because all the deities, the yidams, the
Yeah.
visualizations, the
Yeah.
stuff around it, at that time I thought that's not it. And I had a vague idea. Um, they have this. How do you say in English? Do you say burn religion? The other bone religion?
Bon, yeah, the Bon
Bon.
in Tibet, yeah,
So
which
I
was
said
there.
they had this Bon religion, this
Mhm.
shamanistic tradition, and then they put this onto the shamanistic tradition, and it's just wild, and it didn't appeal to me. Fast forward 40 years, I had to look something up, and I read a book called The Ocean of Definitive Meaning in English. That's
Okay.
the ninth Karmapa, I guess,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yes. And I greatly profited from this book, having 40 years of practice. And then I read something that really hit me like this. And I want to know if you learned anything about this, or if you have
Hmm.
anything to say about this. And it said, clarity, happiness feeling or bliss, and non thought. This is not it. These are meditation moods.
Hmm.
Do not become fettered by them, being happy when they occur and unhappy when they don't occur. And then there's something where I mean, I've looked into it. If you look at it, it appears in many places in Tibetan teaching.
Hmm.
Um, and it says what it is actually about is the union of lucidity and emptiness.
Hmm.
And then I thought, oh boy, oh boy, if that is remotely true, I do judge actually my meditations retrospectively.
Mhm.
If there was a great degree of clarity, if there was even bliss, or how if there were periods of non-thought. That is actually criteria I apply. And now there's somebody, I guess, from the 12th century or so
Mhm.
says, moods. And I thought, come on, moods. These aren't moods. Uh, and now I don't know if I can turn the camera around. Do you see uh, there's
Yeah.
a yard?
Yeah.
This is just all Tibetan Buddhism.
Oh,
Uh,
so
then
now the
a new phase started, and I read a lot of the original sources
mhm.
in the last 4 years. Have you been taught about this? Do you have any idea? I'm wondering two things.
Mhm.
One thing is meditation mood a good English translation
Mhm.
of the original Tibetan? Second, is this true? Is this nonsense? And the other thing is the union of emptiness and lucidity.
Mhm.
I understand emptiness because you will never understand. But I wonder if lucidity is a good English translation of whatever the Tibetan word is. Can you make sense of this whole thing?
I mean, you're definitely very current and still you spend yeah a lot of time in your time in this topic. In the last years, for me, not so much. I just to contextualize, I over the last years I work in organizational change management, so
Hmm.
I help large organizations through either digitalization or large transformation projects on the people side. So unfortunately, my Tibetan is not present anymore after leaving in 2016. I left
Hmm.
India, and if you're not exposed to it, you don't practice it, you don't use it. Like any language, it's not very present. I still know some sentences, some words, but I couldn't say if the translation, unfortunately,
But you've
is a
come
correct
across
one.
that teaching.
Well, what comes to mind is actually different philosophical schools within Tibetan Buddhism
Hmm.
ascribe either a property or properties to emptiness, or emptiness itself is empty, right?
Hmm.
So I forget in which one it is, but in one of the philosophical schools, emptiness is endowed with wisdom and compassion. It
Hmm.
is the essence of emptiness. And other schools say, no, emptiness is empty also of any nature. It is emptiness. Um, I have not heard, let's say, joy or bliss or these things. I mean, as states, yes, but as being ascribed to the nature of mind and therefore the nature of phenomena, it doesn't ring a bell. But I haven't in the last years been, very active in my readings
Hmm.
and the philosophical topic. Um, one of the things about Tibetan Buddhism is there's a lot of variety in the
Hmm.
philosophical interpretations of phenomena. If I remember correctly, in the is it Vaibhashika school, they attribute something similar to the atom as an element which exists and in and of itself, whereas most other schools of philosophy in Tibetan Buddhism uh, don't ascribe anything as being permanent.
Hmm.
It offers the possibility for, I think, in a way, people to find um, teachings which somehow they're inclined to as an entry point to go into the practice and to go further.
Hmm.
The other thing that came to mind, I haven't read the book, my wife did, is it's a book called Not for Happiness by Dzongsar Khyentse Rinpoche, who's
Hmm.
the head of the Rime movement of Tibetan Buddhism, which is the non-sectarian movement,
Hmm.
which takes teachings from the other main schools. And his book is about Buddhism, and it's called Not for Happiness, because my understanding is his point is you don't become a Buddhist to become happy. You don't start practicing Buddhism to become happy. You actually become a Buddhist to work through your karma, to disintegrate or destroy the ego which resides inside of you. And none of this is a joyful sort of activity. There is going to be a lot which is going to come to the surface within this process, which is not going to be joyful. And I would imagine even the joyful one you should not be attached to,
Mhm.
because coming back to your point about the first noble truth, life is suffering, as you know, has been interpreted, or you can use different words for it. But essentially, there's this underlying human condition, which is like, if anything good is happening, we don't want it to end. And if anything bad is happening, we want it to end. And therefore, we are never satisfied. We are always suffering by the mere fact that even something good, part of us says, this is great, please don't let it end. And that is suffering in and of itself. We're already thinking and expecting the end of it and the consequences to the end of it.
Of course.
Um, that's what comes to mind in that sense. But I can't go any deeper in terms of the clarity, right, of the meditative experience and bliss as being a mood or a state, which is, um, you know, is it part of the base fabric of emptiness, or yeah, the other names that we could give to it? You probably know more, or you've read more varying opinions about that.
No, but that was a practically very interesting teaching to me because I saw that over the years I have very subtly developed criteria for,
Hmm.
in an extreme case, this was a very nice meditation today, or this was completely murky. And that there is a mechanism that is attached or hungers after a certain phenomenology, and then says this is meaningful, or
Hmm.
today I was very cloudy,
Hmm.
and that this is on a very subtle level, below words and concepts. This forms over practice,
Hmm.
um, and that is, of course, very dangerous. Because then you might, for instance, you might do a lot of things, say, do yoga, breathing exercises, look very carefully after your food, go to long silent retreats to intensify that
Hmm.
because you got attached to it, which you can in a technical way. You can, to a certain degree, make this more intense and more stable,
Hmm.
uh, but you just have another goal you're attached to, right?
Yeah. Yeah. How to like not be attached to enlightenment and strive for it, if that's the goal,
Yes.
but not be, like, but if there is a goal, then in and of itself you are working against your goal, because there is attachment, or there's the idea of that, as you
Mhm.
spoke about, the reification. Yeah, even creating enlightenment as some sort of thing, or that seems to be practices which take us, or not practices, but more tendencies which then actually take us back in our practice. um you our conversation has also reminded me of my years in Kibi, but also the years before, and how very humbly at the moment my practice is. um it's about my day to day. You were saying earlier, we
Yeah,
see
yeah, of
this a
course.
lot, yeah,
Oh,
in
good point.
the West, and it's about feeling good, but also like just detaching from everything, which is happening, which tends to cloud or to intensify feelings and anxiety and reactions. It's also a good reminder that originally I got into this, to my practice and to the teachings, not for the day to day, but for other reasons, um, which I hope, or let's say different periods in life afford different circumstances and different boundaries to be able to
Yes,
do
but
certain
always
things.
remember, in the mid and long term, it is also the best thing that you can do for your twins.
Mm-hmm.
to pick this up again.
Yeah.
You know, you know what the difference between a Buddhist meditator is and most Western practitioners who are non Buddhists. Those Western practitioners practice for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Buddhists, strictly speaking, do not practice for themselves. Uh,
Absolutely.
and that is something um, that is often lost. There's, of course, a fundamental attitude with which you can sit down on the cushion or not.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, is this trying to make a contribution to the common good,
Mm-hmm.
even if only by being a slightly less nasty person? To, you know,
But
or
absolutely.
is this your personal, super nice, super subtle self entertainment thing, as it is for most people, you know?
No, absolutely, and that's probably a reason why I still consider myself a Buddhist in that sense. I mean, there are certain things like, I mean, I usually say it in Tibetan, but it's like, may all beings have happiness in the cause of happiness. May they be free from suffering in the cause of suffering. May all beings find true happiness, which is free of suffering, and may all beings like operate in equanimity, free from attachment and from aversion. It's just a little prayer that we learn, and that I think I hopefully I've internalized, which is like, um, I'm not doing this simply for my little well-being, as taking the bodhisattva vow,
Mhm.
which we can, yeah, explore philosophically and in many different ways. But the idea is, um, I will not reach enlightenment myself until I have helped all sentient beings. And as a Buddhist, that's the ant, the bee, the human, the cow, the dog, every sentient being reach enlightenment. And so in my practice, even though it's very mundane at the moment, my hope and my goal is that it opens my compassion and my thoughts and my being for the benefit of others. And that's something that still remains after these years of practice, or and these years of studying Buddhism. And these little prayers, and we offer our merit at the end of practices as well,
Mhm.
right? So the idea within Tibetan Buddhism is, yeah, if you sit down and meditate,
Mhm.
you gain merit from it, which is good for you, but don't keep it for yourself. Yeah, that's, you've taken the bodhisattva vow. So offer it to the benefit of all sentient beings, and visualize, you know, every atom in the universe being Buddha or the Buddha of compassion, and that they amplify your wish that this merit benefit all sentient beings. So
Yes, the
that's.
idea is, of course, absolutely clear. The question is, of course, if you can practice it in that way. Uh, I've I have my difficulties with metta and everything conceived of as a practice. It's something. Say, if some person spontaneously wants to give something away or pass merit on, as you said.
Mhm,
It's another thing if that's a regular routine, because you just do that. I think then it is already somehow it's in a goal-directed technical context. It is something that the ego does because it has had some fancy idea and
mhm,
believes in some fancy stuff. I don't know. You've had this conversation with Karl Friston.
mhm,
Uh, if you saw that this emerging picture of brain
mhm.
and mental functions actually, as I would say, dramatically confirms some aspects of the Buddhist worldview, because it really says that all our life, on a much more fine-grained, also mathematical level, is the constant management of prediction error, is the constant attempt, to bring down entropy, free energy, which is a measure for entropy, to
Mhm,
reduce uncertainty, and of which it is completely clear that every sentient being will uh, lose this battle in the end, because we're mortal beings. We can
Mm-hmm.
only stabilize these boundaries around us for a certain time. Now we get a much better understanding of the Bayesian mechanics, the fine grained mechanisms, but it is actually it's it's a new image of man that is
Mm-hmm.
emerging. If it points into the right direction, which very clearly says that actually the essence of existence is suffering, the essence of sustaining existence as a distinct entity is by necessity a constant uphill battle, which may, of course, have on the level of conscious experience, may have phases of peace and tranquility sometimes, or stability. But the body, all the unconscious stuff below that we don't experience, is a fight for survival from millisecond to millisecond. And that it is actually not such a hopeful picture. And I've asked Carl about this. There's a
Mm-hmm.
conversation on YouTube I've had with him, and he thinks no, negative valence and positive valence will just even each other out, or how do you say in
Yeah,
English?
that's what.
It will be just as many negative feelings as positive feelings. I do not believe this. I think if his own model is right, we are in a very difficult situation here, as long as we crave for existence. What Buddhists call bhavatana. I've also written about this in his book about existence bias.
Okay.
We are systems that will always prefer continued existence, even if we know there will be just suffering left, and it's not going to be good. We are these beings, and I find it striking. I don't know if you have any thoughts about this, how the best of modern science and computational modeling actually implies the truth of some central Buddhist teachings, but in a
Mm.
very stark way, in in a more radical way than most of the Western feel-good Buddhists would probably like it. Uh, did you come away with the same impression there?
I actually hadn't connected the two, and now that I mean, when you say it, so I did my best to learn about the free energy principle and active inference as a
Many people do.
yeah, and I seem to have grasped a little bit, but very little bit, obviously. But this idea that um, at the physiological level, that it is a constant, um, the German word Anstrengung, yeah, like
Yeah,
it's a
effort.
effort and tension in terms of predict, yeah, then get sensory input, then do we have to readjust the prediction? Am I changing? Does the brain decide to ignore certain things to assign less meaning to it, or I think Risk called it like
Precision.
yeah, the precision weighted factors and all of this continuously ongoing. Um, a desire to, or not a desire, a function which tries to confirm its own prediction. And if it doesn't work, it needs to then readjust its Bayesian, its priors, and all of that. That does sound like, I mean, I don't know, suffering, because suffering is, it's a concept that we put on top in a way, right? Which is a feeling that we have of certain experiences, but it's definitely something which there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of yeah, effort, and there's a lot of what would be the right word?
Well, it's this constant search for stability and
Correct.
certainty, which is always frustrated.
Yeah, and you can think of it at, almost planetary levels of things coming together, and the violence. There's almost a violence to that continuous,
Mhm.
right, need for adaptability, for adjustment, for expectations, for changing the external world. What I don't know, if I think about feelings and valence, or if I think of my lived experience, um, if I take my understanding of the free energy principle, I mean, there's a set of things happening, and if my brain has then the expectation that out of that I will feel peace
Mm.
or happy, or even if there's a lot of this effort and this thing going on underneath, my experience at the conscious level and my feelings could be peace and
Yes.
happiness. So then I don't know where valence really comes into my understanding and my interpretation of this, because it seems it's a prediction game. How I ended up at some point associating a certain feeling with that set of conditions that are happening, this I cannot say, but I've reconfirmed it over the last 15 to 20 years. That's one thing that I asked Carl about was oh, now I'm going to forget it. What Freud talked about, not projection, but the other one, where we're experiencing something, and the emotion that we bring to the table has nothing to do with the person with whom we're having that experience.
Mhm.
Um, and I asked Carl, well, could it be that the brain is simply ignoring the person that's in front of me and saying every other element fits the prediction of that experience that you had when you were
Mhm.
6 years old, and it reduces the weight of the fact that I'm looking at someone else, so that I can have that it will confirm that experience again.
Mhm.
So it becomes very convoluted to me where my subjective experience of good or bad or valency comes in within the free energy
Yeah.
principle, and let's say the Buddhist idea of suffering and yeah.
Yeah, of course, it's difficult, but there is a striking convergence there, and of course, maybe also a divergence. I mean, reincarnation is out of the window if any of these modern approaches is true. For instance, the question, it becomes very dubious if a really stable permanent state could be achieved ever. But it leads to just the right questions you
Hmm.
have asked. Is there phenomenology which is non-balanced? And of course, on a very abstract level, if you have the global experience of awareness,
Hmm.
and there would be an awareness of that awareness,
Hmm.
one may speculate that this is completely free of almost all priors. It's free of the subject object prior,
Hmm.
but also free of the prior that everything is either good or bad, uh, and so on and so forth.
And I mean, yeah, I asked Carl, or I listened to a talk with Donald Hoffman, who I'm sure you know,
Mm.
and I heard this idea that at some point mathematically time doesn't hold true anymore, and the idea that therefore there must be something beyond space and time, out of which space and time emerges. And I think Donald is trying to mathematically see if he can demonstrate that. I don't know about, you're saying at the beginning, or you mentioned that you could say some things which would probably, I would find, I forget how you said it, but like with regards to consciousness, that would
Yeah,
probably, yeah, be controversial, or at least,
yeah,
make
yeah, of
me,
course.
yeah. And you mentioned that this whole quantum stuff and emptiness, we sort of know um, it doesn't work, or it doesn't. Yeah, it's nonsense, if I understood you correctly. Can you say more about that? Because it's an area that's been interesting to me lately. And I think in the West,
Well, it's
yeah.
of course, I'm not competent to speak about physics. I do not understand this on a technical level, but there are things that are very easy to see.
Mhm,
It In my life, this all started, I don't know what that was, 1976, with Fritjof Capra's book The Tao of Physics. And since then, there are always these, what I call folkloristic memes, something that is in everybody's minds, and it's like a fashion that comes and goes. And
mhm,
so there was this, what philosophers call a fallacy of equivocation.
okay.
If something sounds as if it is the same term, but it isn't in an argument. On the surface, it looks it's the same term. And a lot of the confusion rests on a concept of vacuum in physics and the concept of emptiness in Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, it must be the same thing. Something like this. I would be very careful to draw any conclusions if you haven't, like I have not, penetrated the actual physics on a formal level, on a
Mm-hmm.
mathematical level. It's beyond most of us. And as you know, the term emptiness also has a long, centuries long history. I don't know how it is for you. For me, it's just like I constantly oscillate between, yeah, I have understood what this means. I can explain it to other people, and total mystery. I don't know what they meant. So one has to see that, especially in the West, in some rich countries, I'm sure you've noticed this, pop Buddhism, Buddhist modernism has become an
Mm-hmm.
entertainment game for certain people in the rich world. It's not a really serious project for them. And then they like to play with these ideas,
Mm.
emptiness and quantum physics. And then there are these old sexy things that everything might be consciousness, but we don't know what consciousness is, but we know very well everything is it. And it's just because the old forms of organized religion in the West have become too boring for intelligent people. There is this new movement for maybe a half a century where people, what's the term? It's not a secularized spirituality as something I have written about, but it's a private experience based form of religion. So people just
Mm-hmm.
make their own, they privately construct experiences in meditation, in taking certain drugs and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then they try to gather the right theory
Mm-hmm.
for all this. And this has led to something that's historically new, you know. Everybody suddenly is a quantum physicist. And it must be horrible. It must be horrible for them because in reality, nobody can understand the stuff they're doing,
Mm.
right?
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that I was able to read, some of Carl's papers, or I can read your book, or I mean, Carl was very nice to have a conversation with me, as you could, not to say that I'm a quantum quack, but in the sense that, like he spent his whole life on this, and here I am, and I tried to read six of his papers and say, yeah, Carl, have I understood this and that and how this works?
Yeah.
S- So much patience. And we find this in it, pretty much every field. Anyone can find other people who talk about it and make their own ideas about the topic and connect it with something else which they have read or they have learned, and create, as you said, their own version of what they believe is, and what their place is, or how to connect with it, or how to, what that means for them. And it's something that we have never had historically.
Yes,
um,
and sometimes just comes to my mind somebody says something in passing
mhm,
which opens a completely new perspective uh, for you, which you never thought about. So we have all these Dharma teachers and meditation teachers in the West now.
mhm,
Very many of whom have been monks for a certain
mhm,
time in
yep,
India and then disrobed
mhm,
and returned to the West to teach. And I never thought this was a problem. Many of them are very good meditation teacher. And one time I talked to Mathieu Ricard. He
mm,
said, in passing, he referred to these people as failed monks. And I've never looked at it that way, but that
mm,
from a monk's perspective or from a monastic Buddhist perspective, many of these disrobed teachers in the West are failed monks.
mhm,
That really struck me. Uh, uh, I never looked at it like this, but of course, it's one possible perspective, right?
Yeah, from the emic one, from the goal of the monastic system and whatnot, it's one possible perspective.
Yeah.
That I mean, the Tibetan monastic system in today's world faces a lot of challenges.
Yes.
2,000 years ago or so, the way that we learned it in my studies, 2,000 years ago in Tibet, it was the only place where you could learn to read and write, for example.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, the world was completely different 2,000 years ago. I'm not saying that it was an easy thing to do to be a monk, but today, with the world that we have, it is that the whole system, and Dzongsar Khyentse speaks a lot about that, um, and what it possibly means for the continuation of the
Mhm.
teacher-student relationship and the passing along of the teachings. And for me, no matter what we think of, let's say, the methodology or the teachings, I really wish for them to be passed on and on and on, for that knowledge and that experience to still remain in some people, because then other people can have access to it, and we can learn and contemplate and see where it's applicable, or what we may know today which we didn't know then, and bring those together. And if that lineage sort of dies out, we lose a lot of richness of human experience, and practice and knowledge. But it's a very difficult world for the monastic system
Yeah,
nowadays.
of
That
course. But we have electronic media. We could, in principle, you have gazillions of videos out there right now. They
hmm
don't get lost. It has become a very different time. As I have indicated, what the West maybe really lacks is a secular monastic tradition, so
hmm
that we have something like monasteries, but without some attached religious or ideological delusion to it, without
hmm
authorities,
yeah.
but have the good things and the essence and what was so valuable about monastic life in our cultures as an option, an opportunity for citizens. We don't have
hmm
that. You know,
Absolutely.
if
And
somebody feels drawn to a monastic life or trying out a monastic life,
hmm
but doesn't want to, succumb to any creed or authority, there's no place where they can go. Maybe we should create that.
I, I mean, um, it would be great if that is recognized and appreciated as, um, maybe I'm choosing the wrong words, but a valuable life, in the sense that if a person wants to go and contemplate, go into a monastery, contemplate
Mhm.
about everything, nothing, right? But that we also need that as part of the totality of the activities that we do as human beings.
Oh, of course, of course.
And in our countries, in our cultures, that is not seen from an economic perspective and from a larger
Mhm.
systemic perspective, as something which we should invest in, which has value, which I think degrades our capacity to better ourselves, and our understanding of
Yes, but
ourselves,
I
which
mean,
yeah.
you have just mentioned that these were the only places where you could learn to read and write.
hmm
In the West, many discoveries were made in monastery gardens with herbs and medicines, with brewing beer and stuff. It was also a protected space of studying, and it had
hmm
many different aspects. I only learned a while ago that in a culture, so the question was, when AIDS came, why were suddenly 8% of the priests in the Catholic uh, Church infected, much more than in the general population? And it turns out 200 years ago, if in an absolutely conservative and, how do you say, very disrespectful society, you discovered that you were homosexual,
hmm
one of the best advice one could give somebody is go into a monastery and become a
ah
monk.
ah
Retreat from the world so you don't sin or get entangled in
hmm
anything, But then there are a lot of men there. And there are dorms, and there are people who maybe are there for the same reason than you are. And
Mm-hmm.
so we have this, hidden tradition
Mm.
in the Catholic Church, for instance,
Mm.
which they try to keep undercover. So monasteries were good for many different things over
Mm-hmm.
the centuries. And there's also this tradition I have seen, I don't know where I've seen this, Buddhist monks taking in psychiatrically ill or heroin addicts, especially in Thailand,
Okay.
for withdrawal in a monastery. And this struck me because I thought, isn't it natural to have people who have a mental health problem, to put them in a place where they are surrounded by many mentally very healthy people as an
Mm-hmm.
environment? Because when I first visited somebody in a psychiatric ward in a four-bedroom, I thought I could go in there as a healthy person, as I saw the other patients screaming and doing all kinds of weird things. I would get a mental health problem as a healthy person if you just put me into one of these four bedrooms for 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Um, so it's just the opposite approach. Here we concentrate people with a mental health problem all together, and they see each other
Yeah.
under the medication. But another model is to have few of them in
Mm-hmm.
monasteries,
Oh, very interesting.
surrounded by people who have stabilized their mental health for all of their life.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be a function
Yeah.
for modern monasteries too. Uh, of course, there are so many psychiatric patients that you would probably not
We
afford.
need quite a few monasteries.
But I think you understand this general idea.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Out of, I mean, you've done a lot of research. What are the things that now really stand out to you? What are the things that you feel um, you're I mean, happy is maybe the wrong word, but that you've been able to bring to the surface through your research, through your connections, maybe even through your practice. Um, it's good that we have that knowledge now, and that you want others to know about.
Hmm. Very difficult. So one thing I've learned, it's dangerous not to cook lunch for your wife. So I have to look at this. But another thing is, one area I've been working in is applied ethics of AI a little bit. And I think we are very close to getting absolutely overwhelmed there if we don't watch out. We should invest much more resources in really good young people who are
Hmm.
AI ethicists. And you may know that I've published a paper asking for a moratorium on artificial consciousness, not artificial intelligence, 2 years ago. That until 2050, we should be super careful what
Mm.
we're doing. This, of course, relates to our conversation because we haven't yet understood the deep structure of the human mind. In particular, we haven't understood why our own form of conscious experience creates so much suffering in this
Mm.
world. And we shouldn't carelessly trigger a second level evolution on non biological carrier systems if we cannot exclude that we create a lot of suffering there. Not super
Mm.
intelligence explosion, but a suffering explosion. We should be very, very careful if we haven't, so to speak, solved ourselves first
Mm.
or understand why we, with these brains and this form of so called intelligence, just cannot stop to go to war with each other, why almost all of us are suffering.
Hmm.
We should focus resources on the deep structure of our own minds first before we go very far in that direction. I'm aware that nobody will listen and that greed and scientific careerism will go that direction as early as they can, but
Mm.
at least I've put in that signpost. So there's a connection between AI and consciousness research. And there's even a connection between AI and the fact that even after 2,500 years of Buddhism, we don't have a satisfactory theory of what suffering is.
Mm.
And I think we should just focus much more resources on that, on the elimination of suffering, but not directly in a Buddhist sense, but in a very hardcore scientific sense, because we just don't know uh, how we know what pain is and so forth,
Mhm.
and we have a lot of good psychology, but what the deep structure is that is common to all kinds of preference, frustration, craving, and all these
Mhm.
things, and psychological suffering. This would be important because else we will just get overwhelmed by greedy capitalist investors, climate change, and everything. It's escalating currently. The
Mhm.
situation is escalating. So that's one thing I think that has come out for me. And then another thing that's very obvious is that humankind as a whole is not ready for what is coming out of modern science. So we have 8 billion people on the planet. Almost all philosophers of mind I know are, in one sense or another, materialists. Of course, you have outliers and religious people and people who still believe in life after death, but there's very clearly a mainstream majority trend there. There are
Mhm.
non reductive forms of materialism and different flavors, but there is very clearly a general picture emerging
Mhm.
about evolution, brain, and all these things. At the same time, 80% of humankind are in their personal lives deeply rooted in religious images of man and
Mm.
firmly rooted in religious beliefs. Just look at the way these 1.4 billion people in India are now going with
Mhm.
Modi. Just look at the whole Islamic Arabic world. You know, um, for these people, um, these scientific facts that stare in our face now will deeply emotionally hurt them
Mhm.
because it conflicts with their tradition and the reality models in their brain that they've been
Mhm.
taught.
Mhm.
Fundamentalist religion. Of course, you have evangelicals in the US too, and all that. Um, so science is moving ahead at a great pace, but for large parts of humankind, it is still true that they are deeply immersed in some kind of religious delusion, that they have large parts of their model of reality where they are not accessible to rational argument. They will just not debate this. And at the same time, our Stone Age minds now become coupled to these godlike technologies like AI, because out of science, this technology development, you know, is accelerating exponentially. We get all
Mm.
these tools, and because we have not, how do you say, actually trained our minds, looked deeply into them, liberated ourselves, it's a very dangerous combination.
Mhm.
Artificial intelligence, as such, doesn't create any risks, it's just a technology. But the combination to, venture capitalists, the combination with human greed and our evolutionary heritage, that is very dangerous. That
Mm.
creates a lot of risks in a situation where large parts of humankind will just not be ready to accept anything like what I've called a naturalist turn in the image of man. They will just reject this. So there's an enormous conflict potential there.
Mm.
And I think one thing scientists have to think about too is that their results, of course, we have to have freedom of research, and no question about this, but their results will hurt a lot of people on the planet,
Mm.
you know. And we have to manage this situation too, not to create further military conflicts, for instance.
And I mean, keeping time in mind and the importance of lunch and uh, family dynamics and relationships. Two questions. One, which I think is hopefully they'll be short. One question I like to ask, and I think you just touched on it, is in your view, what would you recommend, or what do you think we can do to create a kinder, more compassionate, and more just society, or just us as human beings? What can we do to become kinder, more just, more compassionate towards one another?
Well, of course, there are all these true political things. One has to act on the surface
Mm,
level. We have to, neutralize the fossil industry and the finance sector that cooperates with them. There are very concrete things that have to be done on the surface.
hmm
But in principle, we have to learn to see the deep structure of our own minds in action very early. And one thing that may be of interest to you, September 12th, there's a working group at the National Academy of Sciences in Germany
hmm
which has done research on self regulation competencies for children and youth. In these medial environments, these addictive environments, there's now a mental health crisis in very young people.
hmm
And I think we have to get, to make a long story short, something like secular meditation training
hmm
and self regulation competencies is a little more into the education system, and not only at some schools where idealistic teachers do this,
hmm
but really top down. We have to scale this. This is a cultural practice like brushing your teeth or something like
hmm
this. There are many open questions. I have learned a lot. So it's not clear, say, a classical technique at like Vipassana.
hmm
Uh, if 16 years old can already do this, or if it's
hmm
too early, if you have, with the maturation of your prefrontal cortex, if
Yeah.
you have to become 18. There are a lot of interesting research questions. If for younger children, mindfulness in movement, like in Tai Chi or Qigong or something like this,
hmm
um, that include bodily movement may not be much better. So we have to do research into what kinds of self regulation competencies at what age, and then scale this quickly
Mm.
so that a new generation can come, uh, which have greater flexibility and, as you say, hopefully also more compassion.
I mean, I'll definitely look into that. And it's something that, as parents of very young children and looking at the next 8, 10, 12 years
How
of the
old are
kids'
your
lives,
twins?
they're going to be 5 in September.
Yes.
Yeah. But I mean, we're obviously on our phones. We're normal humans. We're on our phones, but also every time or anytime we go anywhere, get in any bus, any train, anywhere, all my kids see are people staring at their
Oh, of
phones.
course.
Yeah. So I mean, and my wife and I were just talking about yesterday our own inner tension between being on social media. I'm doing
Yes.
this YouTube channel now, and right, and the kids now. And sometimes we make videos with our kids, and we play them. We record memories, but at the same time, for our kids, there's the world that they live, and they know that there's some sort of other thing out there in which their parents are, and some stuff happens there,
Hmm.
and even though they don't know exactly what it is, this is the world model, which, yeah, if we take the free energy principle, this is the structures that are being built into their brain
Yeah.
at a very young age, which is why we're moving into the countryside, as I mentioned to you earlier, to be much more in nature and spend the time outside. But I'll definitely look into that conference. And I do have that in mind. How do we best accompany our children as they grow up? The world will be what it is. The technology won't go away.
Yes.
And at the same time, we need to give them as best we can the tools, the models, and anything that we can for their own mental health and well-being.
Yes. Yes.
Um,
Being a parent, and this should be my last word today, is really a different task today, because you
mhm,
know that large tech companies uh, in China and in California work in the attention extraction economy, as it is
mhm,
called,
yes.
and attack directly, will attack, algorithmically attack the mental autonomy of your children all the time.
Mhm,
Your children
yeah.
are under attack by these people who try to monetize the attention your children's brain produces,
Mhm,
extracted, directed to customers.
yeah.
So parents have a heroic fight to fight against
Mm,
big enemies,
yeah.
with a lot of money and a lot of computational power. And I think we can't think about this enough.
Well, thank you, Thomas. The last question that I have,
Oh,
it's really the last one is, I mean, Carl suggested I talk to you, and I like to ask my guests in my quest to my curiosity to understand why we think the way we think as human beings. Is there anyone you think I should talk to?
yes, Evan Thompson
Okay.
from Canada,
Okay.
about
Okay.
his book, Why I'm Not a Buddhist. But of course, he will not like to talk about this, because he will try to advertise his new book, The Blind Spot. But maybe you can nail him down on why exactly he's not a Buddhist. Uh,
Oh, that sounds really interesting. Um, and I'm happy to also, if he's got a new book, to yeah, share it so that other people can read it. And in your case, if anyone is interested, I mean, they can just go on Amazon and they will find all of your books. Is there anywhere else that you would direct people if they want to learn more about what you've done, about what you think is important?
I'm just in the
Uh,
process of creating a new web page, but I have an old English web page at the University of Mainz, which you will find. There's lots of stuff there.
Okay, well, I'm going to link to that anyways in the description of this episode so that everyone knows where to find you. Thomas, I feel like we could have spoken another 2 hours easily. I thank you very much for your time and, yeah, for sharing your insights and for challenging my way of thinking, and I'm sure that of the audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.